There we go. We know the recording's working. Oh, 18.
And people are joining. Hello, welcome everybody.
Hello.
It's really weird on a webinar because we can't actually see you, but we know you're here because we can see the numbers increasing. So just so Sarah and I know who is here, please do say hello in the chat. Share
Yeah,
your location and your
it's
URL, LinkedIn
Tanya.
URL as well, so we can connect with you if we're not already connected on LinkedIn. But please do share the location you're tuning in from while Sarah and I do our introductions. So we'll
Yes.
just give it 30 seconds and then I will kick off. Here's Josh from Midlands. Tanya is here as well.
Oh, and
Greenwich.
Greenwich.
Oh, I'm
Lovely.
in London today, hence why my background is very different than normal. Got Vanessa from Cambridge. Where are you, Sarah? You're in Scotland today, right,
I am in
Sarah?
sunny Aberdeenshire today. Not that you can tell from my background, but it's this sort of blank wall, folks. So, oh, the
Oh,
Netherlands. Lovely.
hello, Angela. Hampshire. Sally from Cambridge. Oh, we've got great people. And feel free, like I said, to share your LinkedIn URLs if you wish to.
Do.
And
Networking
then we can make
connect.
sure, yeah, networking, definitely. Kerry shared hers and stuff. Carolyn from Edinburgh, just outside of
Well, I
Scotland.
know that, Carolyn. Carolyn.
Hi all. Oh, welcome everybody. We're really pleased to have you with us here today. So those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Advita Patel. I am the current president of CIPR. I'm also the founder of Comms Rebel, which is an internal communications and employee experience consultancy based up in Manchester or down, depending on where you are. And also the co-founder of A Leader Like Me, which I started with Priya Bates in 2020 and the co-founder of the Asian Comms Network. I always obviously like to co-found a lot of things. I'm also
Good
one
collab.
of,
Good
I know,
collaborator.
I'm also a cultural intelligence certified assessor alongside Sarah. And I think Sarah and I are the only two communication professionals in the UK. But somebody in the comments correct us if you know anyone else. But yeah, so
Maybe
today's
one
session
other.
is going to be all about CQ. And I'm going to hand over to the lovely Sarah Black, who's going to do a short intro about herself as well.
Thank you, Advita. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Black. I am the founder of Aru Communications, the Irish word for change. Originally from Belfast, over the last 15 plus years, I have lived and worked in Cumbria. See somebody from Cumbria in the chat, but also Norway and Texas. And I've worked on global teams as well as 20 plus years in consultancy and a few years in nonprofit. And like Advita, I am a certified cultural intelligence facilitator and assessor, and I'm also an associate facilitator for the Cultural Intelligence Centre. So
Amazing.
this
And
is
so
deep in my blood now.
I know we're loving this. So just so we understand, it'll be great in the comments if you can put a Y or an N on who's familiar with CQ, cultural intelligence. If you are, just put a yes. And if you're not, then put an N. Then we know like what level to kind of pick our talk with you all today. And as we go through the presentation, please feel free to jot down any questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We will hopefully have time at the end for questions as well. But just in case we don't get through all of them, we'll make sure that we get back to you as well offline as and when we can. But let's kick off, Sarah. Can everyone see? Can you see the slides? They're all there, aren't they? I am sharing my
I
screen.
can see them, so that's a good start.
Right, we've done our hello. So, big question to start with. What is culture? Go on, Sarah, I'm going to let you kick this one off.
All right. So when we talk about culture, we are talking about values, behaviors, beliefs that are shared, that are accepted and familiar. So, not every group has a culture, but most cultures have groups. So, we're talking about, as I said, behaviors, things that we have in common that bring us together. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about types of cultures, which I think makes this a bit easier to understand. Advita, we can see all the notes, lovely.
And I don't know what's going on. Sorry, my screen is having a bit of a breakdown.
Oh, there we go. Can I
There
take
we
this one,
go.
lovely? So when we talk about types of cultures, we might be talking about national and regional culture. And when I talk about national and regional, I might be talking about European, British, but also within the UK, we have different kinds of culture. And we may have feel that we are very different in Scotland than we are in Belfast, than we are in Wales, than we are in Manchester. There's definitely, I think, some subtle differences about culture, maybe around language, about how we think about things, about holidays, so on and so forth. But also organizations have cultures, plural. So we might think about functional cultures. So I am a comms professional married to an engineer who works in health and safety. And trust me, we think about risk very, very differently on some other things. So you do see some different values, belief systems, maybe around risk, how we think about the way work should be done, that might vary across functions, professions, teams, and even locations. If you think about big organizations that have either got global locations or even I've certainly worked with organizations where you would move from one building to the next and you can literally feel that the culture is different, that the way they do things around here is different to how they do it, maybe in versus a shop floor manufacturing situation to a very much office based within the one organization, that the way in which work is approached and thought about is very different. Finally, we think about identities and this idea of the worlds in which we figure out who we are. And that can come down to gender, faith, race, ethnicity, generation, political views, can give us very different beliefs and value systems and ways of thinking about how we operate and move through the world. The fun thing is that these three things are always happening at once, and they always overlap. So it can be quite complicated to see where culture sits. But one of the big questions as you're working through something, perhaps you've got a little bit of rub in a relationship or a communications issue, is to think, is there something cultural? And that's you're looking for patterns of behaviors, activities, attitudes, as opposed to personality, which is very much about the individual.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that Sarah and I, are quite passionate about cultural intelligence is because as communication professionals, it's something that can really help enhance our roles. So where Sarah is just chatting about even walking from one office building to another, you would have hopefully in the comments, and it'd be great to, if you resonate with this or relate with this, it'd be great to kind of hear your perspectives as well. Even you can feel the difference. When I worked at Manchester Airport Group, even going from Terminal 1 to Terminal 2, the cultural behaviours were so different from each group of individuals. And if we ever told colleagues from Terminal 2 that they had to go and work in Terminal 1, there was a bit of an outcry. People were feeling quite anxious about going to work in a completely different site, even though it was the same organisation. And one of the questions that Sarah and I often get asked is, why does culture matter? Like, why is it a big deal? Like, why do we talk about it all of the time? And one of the things about cultural intelligence is, and we've been part of this world for the last 2 years now, Sarah. Well, I have for 2 years. You've definitely been longer around that. And it was from Sarah that I learned about CQ. And CQ is often gets mistaken, I would say sometimes, around cultural competence or cultural nuances. And CQ is so much more about it encompasses, it puts all of those things together, sorry, but it's so much bigger than being able to just understand culture or be aware of people's different ways of working or living. It's all about the ability to be able to function effectively in different cultural surroundings, but also be able to understand what your motivators are, what your knowledge areas are, what action you want to take, what strategy you're going to develop. And it's about making sure that you can succeed in today's multicultural and globalized world, because we're living in such a small world. That means that we're working with people who are so different than what would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I love about cultural intelligence is this is based on decades and decades of research. Advita threw out a figure about the number of academic articles to me yesterday, which
10,000 plus academic journals.
Evolving every day. I also love that cultural intelligence, I like to think of it as a muscle that you can build. The more you work at it, the stronger you get. But also as a calm superpower. I love this definition from David Livermore, who has written a lot about cultural intelligence. And he says it's basically how we connect to one another as humans, which I think is absolutely at the heart of what we're trying to do as PR and comms professionals. That's our job, essentially.
And this is why CQ is such a comms superpower. And Sarah and I have made it our own mission to try and educate as many comms folks as we possibly can to understand CQ and how it can help you. So not only, does it help us understand different cultural contexts, as we've spoken about, and like we said, work from one site to another, people are behaving differently, but also can help us understand stakeholder and relationship management. Like I had a session this morning with a coachee that I am working with who is working with a CEO based in Dubai. And she was sharing with me how challenging it is to get him to talk about individual wins. So he didn't want to celebrate individual wins. He's very much about the collectivism mindset. He really wants to work as a team. And she's sharing, she's saying he doesn't like the limelight. And I said, are you sure it isn't about him not liking the limelight? I think it's more about he's got a very collective or a group mindset rather than a competitive mindset that some maybe Eurocentric or Western culture may have. So it's important to know that about your stakeholders that you're working with, your teammates that you're working with, about are we at fault of saying they don't like doing that because it's not their personality or whatever, or is it culturally aligned? And knowing that can give you better opportunities to have wider conversations about challenges that they may be coming across and different suggestions on how you may get that person to speak up about certain challenges that they may feel uncomfortable about.
Yeah, I think it goes a long way. And one of the things that I've done, and I've just done this at a very top line level, but if you look at something like the Global Alliance Competency Framework, which I'm pretty sure you can find on the CIPR website somewhere,
Yep.
a lot of the things that come out of cultural intelligence and the things that research has shown us that it helps you with actually map to the core competencies that are listed on that framework. So thinking about, I think quite often as comms professionals, we tend to segment our audiences based on perhaps what they do or where they're based or their level in the organization or their country, and we just do country. But sometimes we could actually maybe be segmenting them based on their cultural values if we had that knowledge and insight, or be thinking about what their cultural values might be. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But also it's understanding that what leadership looks like and what looks like good leadership in different parts of the world might vary. There are cultures around the world where vulnerable leadership is going to actually really give you a massive disconnect with your people. They're going to be quite unnerved by it. Think about face-saving cultures, what apologies look like, what asking for feedback and handling feedback, but also handling conflict. Not only when we have cultural differences do we sometimes get some conflict, but how we deal with that conflict can vary enormously across cultures. And that really feeds into our jobs, particularly around issues management or difficult news, which we are often tasked with communicating.
Yeah.
So
And that's so
hopefully CQ is a muscle that helps you think about this more deeply, but also makes you more effective in how you do it.
yeah, definitely. Another example I'll share is I was working with another client who talked about they're talking to an Indian office. So there was a group of Indian call center workers, and they had a focus group, like, as you mentioned, Sarah. And one of the comments back from one of the leaders was that Indian people are very quiet and don't like to share information. And it was really interesting to see that perception, but it wasn't that to your point, the way they share information generally in the kind of Southeast Asian continents is very different to how we may share feedback in the kind of Europe, US, and UK. And when I explained this to the group, it was like a light bulb moment for a lot of people. It's almost with that culture, it's asking permission. They don't want to ever talk about their leader in front of their leader. They want to be able to get permission to be able to speak effectively, or wait to be asked to contribute as well. They won't just interject. And knowing those little tips and tricks can make a big difference on how people feel included in conversations. And like you said, it is a massive superpower when you understand these little cultural changes and shifts you can make. And you say, we'll talk about this a bit later on, but you say it brilliantly, Sarah. It's about bending and
bend, don't break.
Bend, don't break. I love that. Because people will say, well, do I need to change my entire personality? I don't work in that way. And it's not about changing a personality, but it is about being agile and bending and flexing and making sure that we're being open and accepting of different ways of working and adjusting the style if the style that we're deploying isn't working.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's get into the meat of the cultural intelligence. Oh yes, some more research things. I love this one. Being high cultural intelligence is correlates with reduced stress and burnout. And who doesn't want that working in comms? And this is really around the idea that there's self-reflection, there's some mindfulness, but there's also a willingness to lean in and work with other people more. It's also research has also linked it to self-awareness and self-reflection, which can massively improve how we show up effectively. Thinking about how you walk into a room and how that might be received or perceived by other people who have different cultural values and ways of working and being to you is a massive help. Really kind of overcomes a lot of barriers. Stronger client and stakeholder relationships. If you are focused on trying to understand the culture, whether it's of a particular function or department, or even a client's organizational culture, how they do things, and you can flex a little bit to meet them, you can remove a lot of stress and tension and build a lot more trust more quickly. And finally, risk reduction. I think we've probably all got a good story that we have read somewhere about an organization that entered a new market and had a little faux pas, shall we say, or something more than a faux pas. And so thinking about that, cultural intelligence is a massive factor in mitigating some of that risk, because you're doing research and evaluation and fact finding that is actually culturally smart, as opposed to the questions that we might think we should ask based on our values and our cultural experience. So some other bonus value adds of building your cultural intelligence.
So now we're getting into what is CQ and what is the model that Sarah and I have been referencing throughout the first part of this session. So the CQ model is based around four key motivators. So there's drive, there's knowledge, there's strategy and action. And we're going to go through each one. We won't be able to get into real detail today, but hopefully give you a flavour of what each one is. But Sarah mentioned David Livermore earlier. I would highly recommend that you check out his resources. He's also the co-founder of the CQ Centre,
He's
right,
the
Sarah?
co-founder of the Cultural Intelligence Centre, and I think he had the founder of the Cultural Intelligence Fellows, the CQ Fellows, and also he's probably written more leadership management books about cultural intelligence than anybody else. He's on the third edition of Leading with Cultural Intelligence, which I think to have a third edition of anything is massive.
Yeah,
One thing
really
I was
good
going to
book.
say before we dive into the model, Advaita, if you don't mind, is
Yeah, of course.
these four competencies or capabilities, you need all four. They're interdependent. So sometimes it's easy to focus on one and go, could do that. But actually you need to work on all four, and you need them all working together to actually build your cultural intelligence. So
You do. And you can do an assessment to understand which
yes.
areas you need to focus on. So when I did mine was definitely around strategy and action. So drive was there, knowledge was there, but strategy and action were my areas that I really had to focus some energy on. It was fascinating to
Yeah.
realize and understand that as well. But if
It
we
is
talk
one of the
about
things that I love, that you can measure this and you can benchmark over time. And actually, the hundreds of thousands of people now have done the cultural intelligence assessment. So we have global norms that you can kind of
I
look at
think it's
where you sit in the world.
130,000, I think, last I
At
looked at
least.
the numbers. So 100,
Yeah.
around 100 globally as well. So you're being benchmarked against so many data points. So this is what we love about CQ, that it isn't just someone's intuition or someone believes this is the
Yeah.
way you should do it. It's actually based on real data points. So the first competency for CQ is your CQ drive. And this is about how motivated you are and how curious you are about learning about different cultures. And it's lent on these kind of three attributes, which is about your curiosity. So how curious are you about other cultures, about other ways of people's backgrounds? How curious are you about learning about other people's way of working and living as well? It talks about confidence. So how much confidence do you have in this? So how confident are you in immersing yourself in different cultures and listening to other people's viewpoints? And what does that look like for you as well? And then competence around this as well. So how competent are you about going and finding out more and having that opportunity to understand where your gaps are and what you might need to be aware of when you're kind of putting yourself through the cultural intelligence model, because you need that motivator and you need that drive to be able to understand and recognize where you need to learn more about and what you need to kind of understand, especially when you are working in that kind of global, multicultural context. Have I missed anything, Sarah?
No, I would just also say that part of your drive is how much you enjoy it. And
Yes.
so some people just intrinsically, you can call it nosiness, you can call it curiosity, I don't. It's how much you just genuinely enjoy learning about other people and about their belief systems and their values. Um, and there's no shame or blame in that sort of thing. I'm going to say there's no judgment in how we assess CQ. The other thing is it does shift over time. So if you're sitting there going, actually, I'm not really bothered, then don't beat yourselves up. Some people are, some people aren't. It's okay. There are ways that you can build and improve your drive, and as there is with all of the competencies. So, a couple of things on that, if I just lead into this, is one of them is to think about your risk and reward. There's a little bit of what's in it for me. We call it your extrinsic motivation. So thinking about what can I gain by getting better at working across cultures? Lots, hopefully. Good for your career, good for your results, good for your impact. But also, what's the risk in not knowing about cultural intelligence? I think we've all seen examples of that. I can think of some that Advaita and I have been commenting on recently, where people just haven't understood what's happening culturally around them, and what's happening in terms of certain identities and experiences. One way to build your cultural intelligence, or sorry, your CQ drive, sorry, is to link it to your personal interests. I have a fabulous friend who's got books on knitting from all around the world, and that's part of how she learns about other cultures. So think about what you already do in your life. Celebrity Race around across the world is coming back. Actually, a great place to learn about some cultures. But do think about it. It could be anything as simple and as light as that to I really want to deep dive into learning more. How do I do that? How do I open my mind to this? The other thing I would say about CQ Drive is it's a great way of looking at your own blocks and barriers. What is holding you back? What might be taking you away from your motivation? And there's a couple of things about this. One of which is sometimes it's about fear and confidence. And Advita will talk about confidence later on, I'm sure. But the other thing is that sometimes if you're kind of saying to yourself, Sarah, like if I was doing an assessment today, my CQ drive would be on the floor. I just am not motivated by any of this. Some of that might be around actually burnout and fatigue. And that can have a really negative impact on your CQ drive. So if you are feeling that, please be kind to yourself and maybe go away and think about what's happening with you. The other thing is that sometimes you'll have so low CQ drive because you don't feel safe in a space to be curious and to be open or to be leaning in. And maybe that's because you're in an underrepresented situation or an identity. And actually, you very well know what the perspective is of some of the more dominant culture, and you don't want to lean into understanding that any more than you need to. So those are things to think about. That in a world where we're all driven to be high and high scoring, that sometimes a low drive can be telling you something that you need to listen to.
And just to add to that, one thing we need to remember is that our brains are here to protect us.
Yeah.
So it will always kind of make sure that you're safe. So if you're ever feeling in a situation where your confidence is a bit low or you're fearing a new situation, because everyone, we're all human beings. We're conditioned to relate to people who look like us, who behave like us. It's our comfort zone. So when you go into a space where you are in a situation where people are different from you, or they're talking a different language from you, or they're behaving differently to you, instantly your mind and body will go into safe mode. And that's where your low drive may come in. So it's just being mindful about the situation and telling your brain, I'm okay. Like I'm here to learn, I'm here to observe, and it's going to be okay. Because your brain will try and protect you and start breaking up some stereotypes or lived or behaviors from your past lived experience. So just be aware of the situation that you're in. But it isn't about giving yourself a hard time at all. And if you don't feel that motivation, then something else is kind of triggering that. So to go and find out what that is and learn more about what's happening to you as well.
Do you want me to take this one? CQ knowledge.
You take knowledge.
Quite often, this is the bit that people go, oh, I can do this. This is learning. I know how to do that. So a couple of things about CQ knowledge. One is about thinking about culture and cultural values. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a set of 10 that we work with in the cultural intelligence world. The other thing is thinking about language, not just in the sense of you need to be able to speak lots of languages. I speak very few, but my knowledge score is quite good. It's actually understanding that knowledge has a different, language makes an impact on how we express ourselves. Great if you can be multilingual. I have huge respect for that. It's not my gift. But I am aware that how people express themselves and how they use language is very different across cultures, and we need to think about that and be aware of it and understand its impact. The other thing is about thinking about different models of leadership across cultures. And quite often, what we think about in terms of effective leadership is very individualistic. Thank you. And yet that doesn't always align. So David Livermore did some research on this, and he said that about 90% of the leadership material he looked at, so I'm thinking of HBR articles and books and magazines and podcasts and all those things, was based on I'm gonna have trouble saying this, individualistic cultural values.
Tongue twister.
Thank you. 75% of the world's workforce is collectivist, and we'll talk more about what that means, but it just means that you may have a disconnect. If you're thinking about leadership being a certain kind of way, it may need to show up a little bit differently. It may need to flex in different cultures. So knowing that there are different leadership styles, knowing that there are different legal systems, different business systems, all of those things are part of building your knowledge. To be practical about it, we do talk about the 10 cultural dimensions. I think Advita's got some on a slide later on, where we can map you actually on where you sit in terms of some of those spectrums from individualist to collectivist. And it's really interesting to do that with a team and see where you sit in terms of your cultural values. We do need to go beyond vocabulary. We talk about language and knowledge. Sometimes that's industry jargon, professional jargon. How well do we speak that language? And do we assume that actually everybody understands us when we talk about perhaps some of the comms jargon? Again, build your knowledge into what you already do. Vary your reading, vary your media, vary the content that you consume will all build your knowledge. But also challenge your assumptions about what you think you know and what you think other people know. I think we all carry a lot of assumptions about the knowledge that we expect people to have, particularly about what we do in comms. Sometimes we do have to explain that a bit more than we might want to. But thinking as well about how other cultures receive information, I think is a big part of the knowledge that we need going forward.
Yeah. And we need to remember that our consumption of information is conditioned to what we often search for, look for, and the people that we follow. So we end up being in a whole host of echo chambers and information bubbles. And even when you're aware of this, you still fall foul to it all of the time. So occasionally you do have to kind of go into your news outlets and your social media feeds and do a bit of a cleanse or do a bit of a refollow of different voices and different opinions. Now, I will follow people who have got very different political views from me, even though it's frustrating, just so I hear different perspectives. Because it's really important that we do have that knowledge around us before we make assumptions about certain characteristics and behaviors. So do a cleanse every so often on your social feeds. Make sure that you're reading different media outlets and listening to different radio shows as well can make a big difference. And those are very simple tactics you can deploy to kind of rebuild, build your knowledge around different cultures as well.
And I think the last thing I want to say about knowledge is, like I said, it's the bit that we tend to rush to, but the research shows us that if we depend too much on our knowledge, we're not actually good at this idea of culturally flexing. And if you just work on the knowledge and don't work on the other three elements of cultural intelligence, what happens is you go into a situation that challenges your knowledge, and then you've not worked on the other bits, so you miss that opportunity to be really truly effective in that situation. So if that's the bit that you're like, I could read things that don't just do that, you need to do a little bit more work than that.
And that's where, so I talked about at the start, where when I did my cultural assessment a couple of years ago, strategy was one of the lowest scoring areas. So I had the drive, had the knowledge, but I wasn't very good at thinking about the thinking, right? I wasn't very good about what does this mean, the planning of, so I understood my kind of gaps, I suppose. I understood where my limited knowledge sat, but I didn't put a plan in place to understand what this looked like. So even as simple as kind of when I went traveling, I never even thought about the different kind of cultures I might interact with and what does that look like. So the strategy element component is all about how you plan, as we would do when we're doing a comm strategy, or if we were putting together a business plan. What does that look like? Where are the gaps? You know, what do you want to be aware of? What do you need to know? What's your awareness as well? So being observant around yourself and being aware of the things that are happening that you need to be adjusting and, bending, not breaking across as well. And being quite, the Cultural Intelligence Centre always talks about making a plan, right, Sarah? Like
Hmm.
writing down the plan. What is it that you need? What is it that, what are the outcomes that you're expecting to achieve from doing this way? So if you were traveling around China, what is it that you want to find out? What are the kind of awareness things that you need to be aware of? How actively are you listening to what's being said around you? And then checking in on some of this as well and making sure that you are reframing and readjusting as much as you're learning as you're going along in the kind of strategy. And I'm terrible. I admit, I hold my hands up that I'm very in the moment. So I will always be quite like, oh, let me just see how it goes and let's me figure it out along the lines. But it doesn't always work in that way. So you do need to have a bit of a plan in there and think about the thinking. So metacognition. No, I can't say that word. Meta.
Metacognition, it's one of my favorite words.
I know, I need to learn how to say that properly, but that's what it's about. It's about thinking about what is it that you need to
Yeah.
do and how you need to plan. So things like a checklist of regular activities and looking at what those pivots are for you and what those potential pivots are. The meetings thing was really interesting about the formats of how people have meetings. I've just got back from India, and I went to speak at a global PR conference there, and it's so fascinating about meeting culture in India compared to the meeting culture in the UK and how people build relationships over there and how they plan for meetings, right? So it's quite my experience was it, and the way I saw them running meetings was quite off the cuff. Let's just grab 10 minutes, 15 minutes here and have a chat on the couch and just catch up. Whereas sometimes, some people want like the agenda and the topic and those kind of things. um, Pause to think and plan, understanding how you show up. So again, an area of an area that I wasn't the best at. I never took that time to reflect and pause for a second to understand what is it that I need to do here? How do I need to show up? And what does that look like? So sometimes we can be a bit gung ho in our Eurocentric behavior where we think our way is the right way. So somebody is a little bit more casual with how they may talk, or they maybe need a little bit more time to do a bit of small talk. We just assume that's the wrong way, and we just need to get straight into business. The great thing I love about the CQ Centre is that they have so many different scenarios that gets your mind thinking about, is this the right thing or the wrong thing? And one of the great things about CQ, there isn't a right or wrong, it's just different. And it's understanding and recognizing that as well. And again, understanding your big why. Like, why are we doing this? Leading back to your kind of key objectives about your going, thinking about your drive, thinking about your knowledge, and putting those actions in place. Have I missed anything on this one, Sarah?
No, I think one of the other things to think about is how you physically show up. We're going to talk about that a little bit in action, but thinking about language, about the non-verbal language. I'm going to use I do use my hands a lot when I'm talking. But thinking about that perhaps a little bit as well, which leads us nicely into action. So planning for that. So action is where it all comes together. We call it behavioral cultural intelligence. It's literally what you do when you've worked through all the other three, and then learning, feeding that back into your drive, your knowledge, and your strategy. This is about being flexible. And as Vita said, for me, this is about bending, not breaking. You should never flex to the point where you feel that you have compromised who you are and what your values are. Um, one of the big, I think, misconceptions about becoming more culturally intelligent is that it's about learning about other cultures. A huge amount of it is about learning about yourself and realizing what your values are, and therefore how far you can bend without breaking. So it's being flexible in our communications, whether that's verbal. There's a great question in the chat from John. Yes, I do think class language, I think I know what you mean by that. But yes, there is sometimes a need to navigate, what's respectful, what's patronizing. do I feel really awkward if I start trying to sound like some of the people I've interviewed, when that's just not who I am. But I can be more formal or less formal depending on the context, perhaps. I talk a lot about the experience of going to work in Texas. And I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself at all seriously. And I had to flex because they just felt that I was completely irreverent and inappropriate. Um, I'm not saying those things aren't true about me. Um, but I did have to flex how I turned up in some of those meetings in order to be effective. It didn't change who I am or what I believe or what's really core to me, but I did flex some of how I communicated it, the language that I used, the non-verbal cues. So it is thinking a little bit about how we adapt. It is thinking about things like eye contact, how you might use your body language. So, a couple of things that you can do to build your action. It's about observing, listening, and being willing to pivot in the moment. So, if you get in and you kick off a meeting and you just have that kind of horrible disconnect feeling, how can I pivot? Is this cultural? What's happening? Preparing and practicing. Um, there's only so much winging it that we can all do, but also being willing to pivot and to fail and learn, and having that mindset that sometimes you are going to misstep and you are going to have to learn and you're going to have to make maybe a cultural misstep. One of the things I love about David Livermore, and if you read even the first chapter of the latest edition of Leading with Cultural Intelligence, he talks about the moments where he still missteps and where he still goes, oh, I just didn't understand what I needed to do here culturally. I needed to ask that question differently to get to the outcome and the objective that I needed. And the other thing is seek feedback, obviously in a culturally intelligent way, but do seek feedback, check in with people, ask, did that, what's the disconnect? And sometimes people will be willing to tell you. You need to think about the cultures where people might not be so comfortable telling you, but do look for feedback. Do use things like a cultural intelligence assessment, and lean into those tools to think about how you can learn to flex more appropriately. A lot of times about perspective taking, which I think strategy and action particularly help you with, which is trying to understand not just kind of that avatar audience profiling that we've all done at some point, but really trying to understand how other people see the world and therefore how they see some of the issues that we're trying to communicating around. So with that, Edvita.
I know it's great. I was just going to say on the action thing, one very practical thing you can do around action is watching different, I mean, it's really simple, but watching different movies from different countries. And that was something that
Build your
really
knowledge.
helped. Honestly, the knowledge and stuff around that, and to understand what type of action to take as well when you're listening and observing things from different backgrounds. And because some people will say to us that, well, I don't travel a lot, or I don't get the opportunity to kind of immerse myself in different cultures, but it's so much more than that.
Mhm.
It's recognizing and understanding that, as Sarah said, people will, even in the workplace, if you think about your workplace right now and the people within that workplace, the differences that people are bringing from their lived experiences and how they may react to certain situations is so different to how you may react or how another peer may react. So
Yeah.
just being quite mindful.
And I would also say that this is the royal we, this is we, the entire world, right, folks, not just wonderful people on this call or their profession. Generally, listening is an underrated skill. And listening can be impacted by a disconnect in cultures. How well we can hear people can be impacted by what our expectations are. So you think about situations like interviews and how you expect people to turn up because of your organizational culture, your own national culture, and how they might express themselves, can really impact how well you hear other people. And as comms professionals, we need to be good at hearing people. A quick word on culture intelligence for crisis planning and crisis management. I think this is massive. I am starting to investigate this more at the moment. So if anybody would like to talk about it, please call me. Traditional stakeholder mapping. I think I've seen work from both Amanda Coleman and Philippe Boremans that says this is no longer quite the way of doing things for crisis to be effective. And I do think what cultural intelligence teaches us about perspective taking and about cultural values can really help us dive deeper into what people need and want from us in crisis situations, how we respond. The old school of we have a single statement, a single message, we're going to communicate it everywhere. with the communications messages and platforms that we have now, being culturally intelligent about that and adapting to the audience, massive. But also understanding how cultural values influence our response. The things people are going to care about in a crisis may flex with their cultural values. And I think also thinking about what we don't know about audiences and their responses. I think it was Philippe Bormans on one of his calls last year talked about emergency aid being dropped into a situation where the language on it, the how to use this package was not in a language that anybody on the ground spoke. So thinking about how we think about those issues, massive for how effective we are in crisis situations. And that's before we even start to talk about AI and the complexity of misinformation and disinformation. So some really kind of top line thoughts there on crisis.
And one is a really good book to review is Rebel Ideas by
Yeah.
Matthew Said. He talks about catastrophic situations that have happened because not we've like we, but global we, like Sarah, have caused,
All the we's.
yeah, of the we's, have caused massive catastrophic issues across the globe.
Yeah.
And there's a very quick story before we move on to the AI section is where, there's a 90 in the late 70s, the behavior around an engineer and a pilot, was from a different kind of background, and the engineer was different background, and miscommunication between them two
Yeah.
made killed over 280 people. And the same with, when Bin Laden came onto the scene in those days, people, the FBI who were following his footsteps thought he was just a crazy man wearing rag clothes, and what he didn't realize in the Islam culture, that's actually a sign of power. So it's things like that you need to be quite mindful of. But Rebel Ideas is a great book to kind of get a bit of a sense of how these catastrophes could be avoided if we had a bit of cultural intelligence around us as well. And crisis is definitely an area that we should be looking more deeper into. And there's lots of different examples, which I'm sure Sarah can pick up on. AI, everyone's favorite subject. I'm just going to pause for 1 second, and if we can answer a couple of questions, Sarah, before we
Yeah.
go into AI,
Let's see what we got.
see what's going on here.
Um,
So,
does channel culture exist? I think the answer to this is down to, are you seeing shared behaviors, shared values, and I suppose a bit chicken and egg. Does the channel create the culture, or do the people in it create it? Advita, I'd like to hear what you think about that.
it's so interesting. Do you know what I don't know, Tanya, to be totally honest
Mhm.
with you. I don't know if it does exist, the channel culture. I think we need to do a little bit more research into this space
Mm.
and look at the data points in terms of what they are telling us. I'd be curious to know if anybody else, if those folks who are listening, what you think. I don't know, but there's not enough data points for me to have an opinion or even a statement
No.
on this. I need to really investigate a bit further. My
Yeah.
intuition is kind of saying it probably does exist, but I
Mhm.
don't have any backup on that at all.
My
Uh,
my gut, which is not at all scientific, as Advita well knows, would be that it's possible that depending on what the channel is like, it may be
yeah.
fostering a certain style of communications, which might feel cultural. So if everybody uses, I don't know, Slack in a way that's very abbreviated, very short, the question is that then bringing their culture into the communication tool, or does the communication platform kind of create a communication style? But my kind of word of caution is that culture is bigger than that.
Mm,
So it's really about how you show up,
your
what your
shared values, your
behaviors,
beliefs, your
norms
norms.
are
Yeah.
when you're not on Slack or not
Yeah.
using that tool. I do
Uh,
think there are ways of being that some channels might um, encourage, amplify. I don't know what the right word is there, but yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So CIPR research next year, folks. Maybe that's where that needs
Maybe
to
somebody put
go.
it through. I think it's fascinating. I do think but we just don't have any data to back that up, do we? On whether, but
No.
I would, that word of caution from Sarah, I would definitely emphasize to say,
Yeah.
let's not forget about the why the behaviors are driving the behaviors on the channels.
Yeah.
Often is the reason why the culture may exist on those channels.
Um,
Um, bend not break idea, but in reality, so it's Tanya again, but reality balancing our
Mm.
values and our org values can be difficult. Do we have any tips? Do we find sponsors? Do we find mentors? Do we in times just send and then influence via feedback?
Oh, I feel that deeply. They just send and then hope that you can figure it out. Um, I think all of us at some point are going to struggle with org values and our personal values. Um, and one of the things that I personally wrestle with is this idea that organizations have values. Um, because I think there's so many cultures, plural, within organizations. And so the idea of there being one overarching, we all share the same values. I don't know, I've got big questions about that in my head at the moment. And I don't have answers yet, but I think the most important thing is to keep checking in with yourself and to keep having conversations. And yes, I mean, I think generally in life, yes to mentors, yes to support, for all kinds of reasons that aren't even to do with cultural intelligence. But Advita, what do you think?
I think we need to be mindful about the ethical dilemma that we're often facing, right? And this is where CIPR are quite hot on in terms of making sure that we are advising and guiding our leaders in an ethical way.
Yeah.
And of course, there's going to be situations where our values don't align with some of the decisions that are being made. And as Sarah says, we need to be quite mindful of what this means for us,
Yeah.
integrity wise. And there will be organizations that you just can't succeed in or you don't want to succeed in because it goes completely against how you feel and what you should be standing for. And that's something to be mindful of. And not everyone has the privilege to kind of exit those types of organizations, but you do need to be careful about the impact it's having on your mental well-being. If it's an ethical dilemma or a moral dilemma, then that is something that you need to seek guidance and advice on. Um, if someone's asking to do something that goes completely against the values of the organization, then my advice is always to challenge in a respectful way and remind people of the organizational values. Ultimately, as communication professionals, our role is to guide and advise, and the decision stays with the leaders and the decision makers. We need to make a call for our own kind of future in that organization, whether we want to stay and gift our skills to them and go against our integrity, or do we want to leave? And that is a tough call, but we do need to sense check within ourselves frequently. I am a huge advocate of coaching and mentoring, and also make sure that you use the ethics hotline that CIPR have. So if you are facing something that goes against the grain and not quite certain or sure if it's the right thing to do, then pick up that hotline. As a member, you've got free access to that. Talking it out with somebody will always help, but I'm not, I mean, if it's not breaking any kind of ethic code or it's not kind of, morally wrong, then sometimes just sending and seeing what happens can help to see the feedback because you can use that as a benchmark on how people reacted. But I would be, like Sarah said, just be quite mindful about how it's impacting you and the people around you when you're doing things that goes
Yeah.
against your values. And also to the org values, and a reminder to the leaders about the
Yeah.
values is quite important.
I think also one of the things that I hope cultural intelligence helps people with, that I think it does, and the evidence is there, I think, to support it, is about building better relationships with people that you work with. And that's again coming back to the perspective taking and thinking about what is the culture like in the boardroom. Um, what's my CEO's kind of cultural values? What's she, they thinking about? What matters to them? Um, do I need to flex how I show up in order to build the trust to have those conversations so that we don't have a cultural disconnect? I think somebody had a question in the chat about language that we use, the way we talk about things. That's a big part of action and that flex, because quite often you're not changing what you're actually saying, the message, you're changing how you might show up with it.
Yeah.
A bit less irreverent in my case in Texas, but still staying true to who I am in terms of what saying it. I think the last question there is about how cultural intelligence can best be used in change communication. Well, that feels like a book, Jonathan. Um, so I'm going to say relationships, the idea of perspective taking, of really sitting back and going, what matters to people? How are they going to show up? Thinking about the responses. I think change is really scary. I would say thinking about people's drive, what's going to motivate them, what's going to build or knock their confidence. And this is all leading into my next slide so beautifully. Thank you. Um, but thinking about those things, think about what knowledge they need, using, if you like, the model to kind of work through people's reactions and the perspective taking that you need. and also thinking about flexing how you talk about change. To the point, John's question around language and how people talk about things or write about them, even the form of communication they use. So thinking about that in terms of how culture shows up and then building that into your change. I also think this speaks to another slide we have coming, but thinking about cultural values around risk and uncertainty. Change is about uncertainty, it's messy. Um, and there's different ways of thinking about that. So, I mean, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be fab? Unlimited budget. I would be doing a cultural intelligence mapping on some cultural values before I did a massive change program, because I'd be looking at where the people in the organization sit on the uncertainty avoidance spectrum.
Mm.
And I think that would be fascinating to see how that impacts how you run your change. Because a lot of people are like, go with it. I thrive on it. I love a bit of chaos, me. I
Mm.
am not that person. Um, but but some people are much more geared to we must have a process and there needs to be a system. And that shows up really interestingly when you work across national and regional cultures.
Yeah. Well,
So
I've actually used CQ in change programs. So similar to what
yeah.
Sarah said, I've looked at the change curve and adapted the behaviors and the questions that leaders may ask based on the drive, as Sarah said, and cultural values. So in one change program, we did actually do it was a restructure, and we did actually do the cultural values for the executive team to see where their cultural values sat before we went into a big restructure, because the CEO was quite keen to understand who were the more risk averse, I suppose, or who were the more open to the change, and he wanted to understand where his team were. And to Sarah's point, it's very powerful.
Yeah.
And you can, if the leadership team are aligned and comfortable to an extent about what's happening, then the likelihood is that the rest of the organization is going to hopefully get the benefits of CQ. But there's so many different ways you can use CQ in change. But I use the change curve model, which I know the Culber-Ross model, which I know some people don't like, but I like it because it allows you to see different steps of change, and also link that with cultural values. And both of us are happy to talk to you about how you can do that as well,
Yeah.
Jonathan. So
Yeah.
AI, everyone's favorite subject, Sarah.
I mean, you can't do a comms call these days and not talk about AI, can you, Vita? I am fascinated by the potential overlap between cultural intelligence and AI. I have written a paper about this. If you want to deep dive, this is a very top line summary about it. Which is, and I think I've touched on this in answering the question about change, thinking not just about our own drive, why are we motivated and how confident do we feel about embracing AI, but thinking about other people's responses and their motivations, and then thinking about the leadership comms and how does that impact people's drive? How do we tap that into where people may be sitting on this, whether they are terrified or excited? There's a whole lot of research about where people sit on this, and then how do we build confidence? But again, watching out for those red flags that I talked about earlier, where people are fatigued, where they are scared for their jobs, and the barriers that that sets up in terms of flipping that into motivation. We talk about knowledge. I love a good definition. If you're communicating about AI, please could you define what you mean by AI? That would make me very happy. But I do hear a lot of people talking about AI and meaning ChatGPT or meaning a large language model, whatever it happens to be. Being really clear about what AI means in your organization if you're doing it internally. Knowing when to use it is a new form of knowledge, I think, for all of us. Thinking about the ethical implications, Advaita touched on this, but thinking about issues like copyright, what are the ethics in this new world of AI, which is how I've put this together, is the idea that AI is a new country and therefore perhaps has a new culture. Think about who's missing in the conversation about AI, whether that's in terms of creating it or the dialogue that we are having about it. There is a lot of narrative around the fact that we're all wildly excited about AI or it's the next big thing. I am pretty sure there are people walking through the world who are not, and who it's not, doesn't feel relevant or they haven't engaged with it. So we just need to be mindful of that, particularly in large, complex global organizations. And then also the ever evolving regulatory and legal systems around AI are new knowledge areas for all of us. Thinking about strategy, metacognition, critical thinking, challenging our own perspectives and our own beliefs about AI, but also thinking about how can we be agile and flexible in the new world of AI. And very important, that try, learn and fail mentality, but very much thinking about what are the human skills and the human strategies that we need around judgment. Action, it's still bend but don't break. As we think about AI and its increasing complexity, knowing your own values, to go back to that point, knowing your organization's values, knowing your ethical standards and boundaries, and those of your organization is going to be crucial to how you adapt to the new world of AI. So if you're interested in that, drop me a DM and I'll sort you out with the paper, which goes into it in a lot more detail. But I think it's a useful compass for thinking about how we get to grips with AI.
And then we've kind of mentioned this throughout the talk, and we could do a whole talk again about cultural values, but we wanted to kind of give you a flavor of how these cultural values may show up in your organization or the teams that you support. And we've picked there's 10, and we've kind of chosen the 4 that you may come across as a communication professional in the workplace. So individualism and collectivism, as Sarah said before, majority of us believe that we're in a collectivism mindset, right, Sarah? But
We'd all like
most
to
of us
believe that.
yeah, but most of us are actually individualism. And what that means is that collectivism is about the group work. So we want to work together, a teamwork. Individualism is me and my own. And it's really interesting how research shows that most folks think they're in that team space, but actually it's everyone's in that kind of not everyone, but majority are in individualism.
And one of the reasons that certainly when I do training and we go into this in a lot more detail is that I always start with this because this is at the core of who we are. Individualists define their identity based on me, myself, and I. So self-directing, autonomous, all of those things. Collectivists base their identity on who they are in relation to others. So I am part of CIPR Scotland. I'm part of a leader like me. For my identity much more than who I am. And that can actually affect things like how you think about money and how you think about responsibility. And it doesn't mean, by the way, if you're an individualist, that you're not a great collaborator. Individualists are great collaborators, but their sense of who they are is ultimately rooted in themselves. And so a lot of what you read about leadership is very much biased towards that, as opposed to, I am a leader because these people follow me. I am a leader because, all of those things. So I think that's a really important one to reflect on. And I quite often do polls and people go, I'm a collectivist. And I'll be like, I don't know that you are, really.
I was like that. I'm a collectivist. I'm actually lean slightly in towards the middle a little bit. And I think that's because I've adjusted my style a lot. Then you got low power distance and high power distance. This is about how people regard hierarchy and leaders. So you've got people who are more than okay to challenge leadership, have conversations, raise issues and concerns. And then you've got people who respect that hierarchy and are a little bit more reluctant to speak to hierarchy. And I mentioned it before, in places like China, India, Malaysia, are very kind of have high power distance and are more not reluctant, but more they wait.
They don't feel it's appropriate.
Yeah, they wait until they get permission or they do it in a one-to-one. They will never speak up against a leader. They're very respectful, sir and ma'am. Like even when I was in India, people were calling me ma'am everywhere. I went and stuff, and it's just it's bizarre, but it's the way that the respect and stuff is there.
And it impacts how you might ask or offer feedback. I think that's really important. If you're in a low power distance culture, then it's fine to go, actually, I don't agree with you in the middle of a meeting. If you're in a high power distance culture, that's going to go over really badly.
Yeah. And then you got cooperative and competitive. So cooperative is we did this together. So this is a teamwork. We did it together. We helped each other out. And competitive is that I want to win. Like this is my thing, and it's very competitive mindset, really. And there's nothing wrong with either or, but it does help from a comms perspective when we're rewarding and doing recognition. Some people will enjoy that recognition, and some people won't enjoy that recognition, and they find it very uncomfortable. And we have to be quite mindful that we're not pushing people into a space that they're just not comfortable with. So just being aware of what that means in the organizations that you're supporting and the people that you're supporting as well. There's like I said, there's no right or wrong in either one, but people have a very different way of wanting to celebrate and how they work and get rewarded and recognized for the work that they do. And then the one again, which I think some of you will be familiar with, is that direct communication and indirect communication. So you'll have people who are very good at kind of speaking up and telling you exactly what is what. And then you have the folks who are more indirect and more about non-verbal cues in how they communicate, and just being quite mindful that just because somebody hasn't said something doesn't necessarily mean that they are happy with the situation. You can normally tell by the non-verbal cues, and that they're very suppose more they position themselves with their body language and the way they react in a situation, rather than just telling you that something's wrong.
Direct communicators, of which I am one, will just tell you what they mean and mean what they say. Indirect, you're looking for a lot more subtlety and decoding sometimes if you're a direct communicator from what someone's really trying to tell you. So again, really important for feedback and also for briefing. Think about the kinds of questions you want to draw out. We are 1 minute over time, Advita, I think.
We are. So here's some further resources that we've spoken about. Sarah does an incredible podcast as well, so make sure you check that podcast out. We've spoken about David, the CQ Centre as well. So just Google CQ Centre. They've got lots of resources on there, and Sarah and I can also share more. And The Shift, which is a fabulous podcast with Trisha Carter, is worth looking into. I've got a book coming out next May where I talk about cultural intelligence and confidence. So if anybody wants to have a chat about that, we can do. You can also pre-order that. And then you've got Sarah's podcast. So please do get in touch with us if you have any further questions. Hopefully that whistle stop tour on CQ has given you a little bit more understanding
and I was going to say
is.
It's such an almost superficial look at it. It's an introduction. It's to give you food for thought, because typically if I come and talk about cultural intelligence, it's a minimum of 4 hours to get you really kind of into it. Quick question in the chat about some tools for assessing CQ. All our assessments are done through the Cultural Intelligence Centre. So if you want to start with your own assessment, that has to go through them, and that is unfortunately a paid assessment. But it's not wildly expensive in the grand scheme of things. And Alison Arnott, I will be in touch with you to talk about crisis and cultural intelligence. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. If there are any questions that were not answered, or you mull over things and you're thinking, I really wish I asked this, then drop Sarah and myself a DM on LinkedIn, where both of us are on there. We're also more than happy to share resources with you. Sarah is the queen of comms CQ. So if she doesn't know it, then likelihood is no one else will when it comes to the communication side of CQ. So please do get in touch with her. But if you are interested in either becoming a certified facilitator or taking your certification or doing the assessment yourself, then we can help you with that as well. But thank you for your time, energy, and the fab questions that you all asked.
Great thought-provoking questions. I always learn as much from these sessions, I think, as I hopefully share, because you always give me great things to think about. Also, Advita and I will be at the CIPR annual conference. We're not officially talking about CQ, but find us at the coffee breaks. I'm sure we will.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, 13th of November. So if you haven't got your ticket, make sure you do. They are selling out fast, and that's not a scarcity tactic at all, I promise you. They definitely are. Pat's told me. So check out the conference on the 13th of November. We've got some great speakers. Sarah and I will be there. We're always happy to have side chats about CQ and what that means and what definitely. But thank you, everybody, for your time. And we'll see you next time. Take care of yourself.
Take care. Thank you.